So, as I mentioned in the introductory video, after completing part 1, the multiple choice, you want to skip right to part 3, the civic literacy essay. And the particular reasons for that are that it is on both parts of the conversion chart that finalizes your grade on the exam. So the short essays are only going to be on one part of the conversion chart. The multiple choice is only going to be on one of the sides of the conversion chart. But multiple choice, there are 28 of them, so that is your top priority. It is going to be a large portion of that one side. The civic literacy essay is your next highest priority because it appears on both sides of the conversion chart. To start off with, you always want to outline your work, even if it's very, very brief. And the way of outlining with these new styles of essays on the new framework exam, you're almost always going to take the same exact approach regardless of what is included in the documents. So no matter what your civic literacy essay topic is, and we don't yet know what the topic we're dealing with right now is, you are still going to state the historical context of what is going on at the time that you're writing about. And after a couple of sentences, this is usually 2 sentences or so, you're then going to have a single sentence, and I always recommend that it be a certain type of thesis in listing thesis. So your listing thesis, for example, if you were writing an essay about your 2 favorite New York Yankees of all time, 2 of the greatest Yankees of all time were Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson. Therefore, your body paragraphs are going to be about Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson. Now, when you talk about your civic literacy essay topic, you are almost always going to follow this exact format, and that is to talk about the civic issue. This is going to be an expansion upon your historical context above. This is going to be very much a summary. It's also a good chance to bring in some outside information. Then, in your second body paragraph, you are going to talk about the efforts to address that civic issue, and were they a success or not, those efforts. That's going to be your second paragraph. Now, when you get to your conclusion, you want to restate your thesis at the beginning this time of the conclusion rather than at the end like it was in the intro. Now, use new words, okay? It's cheesy to just word for word restate it. My best suggestion for using new words is flip the order of the sentence. So, in the listing thesis I generically gave before about the 2 favorite Yankees, 2 of the greatest Yankees of all time were Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson. To restate it, I can say the same exact thing without sounding repetitive by simply saying Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson were 2 of the greatest Yankees of all time, period. I'm saying the same exact thing simply by flipping the order of the sentence around. It is a very effective way of not being overly repetitive in your work. Once you have restated the thesis, any of the information that you've included in the body paragraphs that you think is the best information, you summarize that in the end of the conclusion. So you want to summarize your major points that prove your thesis to be correct. So what major points did I make above in the 2 body paragraphs that said how Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson could be considered 2 of the greatest Yankees of all time? Now, regardless of your civic issue or the efforts to address it or the success or failure of those efforts, you're going to have bulleted points, okay? Very generic. You're just going to have bulleted points of information. You might have some extra details where you indent on that. And the reason I'm going through this, even though it's very generic, is eventually you're going to utilize information that is from a document. So let's say this randomly is from document 3. Why do I want to include that information on my planning outline? Well, because when I do that, all of my thoughts are on one piece of scrap paper that I can then reference to write the essay. Now, even though I'm going through this in a lot of detail for this review, you're not going to want to do it all that extensively on the day of the exam because the outline cannot be graded on the exam. Only the essay itself can be graded on the exam. So you do want to be as brief as possible, but for practicing your outlines, go ahead and be detailed because it can only add to your studying for the exam. So same thing in the second paragraph. If you are addressing efforts and whether they were successful or not, and you're taking nice notes, and you're even adding detail to some of those notes, eventually you're going to come across something that comes from a specific document. You want to use more than half the documents. So if there are 6 documents, you want to use at least 4 of those documents. And this is the meat and potatoes of how to go through the civic literacy essay, just generically. Now, to go into a specific example of the civic literacy essay, we can look at this sample from your practice exam that I gave you in class. So this assignment page, and I've pointed this out before in class, you can see here that the topic is freedom of speech during wartime. And many constitutional and civic issues have been debated by Americans. One of these constitutional and civic issues is freedom of speech during wartime. So that is the only thing that is going to look any different. The task, the bulleted points of what you need to be addressing is all always going to be the same. And as you see, historical circumstances is one of the first things that you have to address. If you look back, historical context is addressed right away in the outline. Explain efforts to address this constitutional or civic issue by individuals, groups, or governments, and then discuss the impact of those efforts. So, again, going back, this first paragraph is going to be your chance to give a summary of the issue, perhaps some outside information on the issue. Then you need to talk about the efforts to address that issue and were those efforts successful or not. These are all directly addressing the bullet points on the assignment page. Now, before you can outline and effectively write an essay, you got to go through the documents themselves, study them, and come up with answers to the individual questions that go along here. These are individual points that you earn, and they, as I said, get added to, usually the traditional way of doing it is added to your multiple choice score on one axis of the conversion chart. Then all of your essay scores get put into the other axis. So answering these questions is going to be on one axis, and then your actual essay score is going to be on the other axis, so that's where it shows up in both places. But to go through this document, we must first follow the SQUID process. Consider the source. This is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, 1789. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, why did I highlight freedom of speech and then of the press? Well, that is the topic that they gave us on the assignment page. Freedom of speech during wartime. So now, based on this document, identify one freedom guaranteed by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Boom. Freedom of speech. Or freedom of the press. Notice that between all of these commas and semicolons is a list of different rights. You're also going to notice that I just violated my own process, and it shows how easy it is to do when you get into the flow of things. I did source things, yes, but I did not then read the question before I read the document. Luckily, this one is very short. It didn't impact me all that badly. So you would want to do so in a complete sentence, but for the sake of time, you're either going to mention freedom of speech, and since that is the title of it, you could also say freedom of the press, but let's go ahead and say you want to, in one single sentence, summarize that the First Amendment guarantees a freedom of speech in the Bill of Rights. Documents 2A and 2B. So these, if I source them, are the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. So espionage and sedition acts during World War I. We learned about this. Now, what is going to be asked of me, following the squid process properly this time? Based on these documents, state one action made illegal by the Espionage or Sedition Acts. So all we have to do is find one action made illegal by the Espionage or Sedition Acts. Now, make note to yourself, though, that you are going to want to fully analyze these documents because there might be even more additional information that you can later use in the essay that goes beyond what you're going to use to answer the question. So to now go through the acts, the Espionage Act, which is document 2A. Section 3. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination or refusal to obey orders, is all insubordination means, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. So you'll notice shall willfully make or convey, shall willfully cause, willfully obstruct. So after willfully, you're going to notice, and willfully just means you are knowing what you are doing is convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere. Then willfully cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty, shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment of service of the United States. And then the punishments. Some of this should sound very familiar from when we covered Schenck versus U.S., the Supreme Court decision. So, document 2B is the Sedition Act of 1918. So, Section 3. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States. So this is all very similar sounding language. Make or convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operation of the military, or to promote the success of its enemies, or shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements to incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military and naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruitment or enlistment of the United States, or shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, which just means with the intent to damage a reputation, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military and naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully display the flag of any foreign enemy, or shall willfully urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production, or advocate, teach, defend, or suggest the doing of any acts or things in the section enumerated, and whoever shall by word or act support or favor the cause of any country with which the United States is at war, or by word or act oppose the cause of the United States therein, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000, or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. So you have a lot of information here. Okay? Now, the one that I think stands out the most to me, that is going to be probably related to another document. I'm going to wild guess that if this is about free speech in wartime and they're talking about the Espionage and Sedition Acts from World War I, that you are going to be dealing with the obstructing the recruiting or enlistment in the United States. And it's down here again. Obstruct the recruitment or enlistment of the United States. That, if you remember correctly, is what Charles Schenck was doing when he was issuing his leaflets telling people to refuse service. Okay, so you're stating one action made illegal. You can combine these two things and simply say, in both the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and then summarize the point that the obstruction of the recruitment or enlistment of the United States services was made illegal. So this is something that I'm going to wild guess is definitely going to come back and be a part of our assignment as we move forward. Document 3, if we source it, is a pamphlet created by the United States Socialist Party in 1919. So it gives us a nice caption ahead of time, too. You can consider this caption at the beginning sourcing information as well. In 1919, 15,000 leaflets urging resistance to the draft were sent to men who had been drafted by the U.S. Army. The leaflets were traced to Socialist Party headquarters, specifically to Charles Schenck, the General Secretary of the Socialist Party, who publicly and vocally had opposed United States participation in World War I. This took place during a period known as the First Red Scare, during which concern over the spread of communism was high in the United States. So you can read through the leaflet in a minute, but first, what is going to be asked of you? Follow that squid process. Based on this document, identify the point of view of the United States Socialist Party concerning the Conscription Act. So, long live the Constitution of the United States. Wake up, America. Your liberties are in danger. The 13th Amendment, Section 1 of the Constitution of the United States says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to the jurisdiction. The Constitution of the United States is one of the greatest bulwarks of political liberty. It was born after a long, stubborn battle between king rule and democracy. In this battle, the people of the United States established the principle that freedom of the individual and personal liberty are the most sacred things in life. Without them, we become slaves. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States embodies this sacred idea of personal liberty. This idea is violated by the Conscription Act. When you conscript, which means to force a person to join the military, a man and compel him to go abroad and fight against his will, you violate that most sacred right of personal liberty. A conscript is little better than a convict. He is deprived of his liberty and of his right to think and act as a free man. A conscripted citizen is forced to surrender his right as a citizen and become a subject. He is forced into involuntary servitude. He is deprived of the protection given to him by the Constitution of the United States. He is deprived of all freedom of conscience and being forced to kill against his will. Write to your congressman and tell him you want the law repealed. Do not submit to the intimidation. You have a right to demand the repeal of any law. Exercise your rights of free speech, peaceful assemblage, and petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. This is even more constitutional language. So you can see some of this, like involuntary servitude is mentioned in the leaflet after having been quoted from above. So it's mentioned here that technically drafting someone is on involuntary servitude, and that it is quoted up here from the 13th Amendment. So based on this document, identify the point of view of the Socialist Party concerning the Conscription Act, that it equates to slavery, involuntary servitude. You can summarize that here. I won't take the time now to do so. I have faith that you can make a complete sentence out of that idea. Document 4. So this source is a speech by Senator Robert M. La Follette called Free Speech in Wartime, given in the U.S. Senate, October 6th, 1917. Now, what is going to be asked of us from Follette's speech? What is one argument against restricting free speech during wartime, according to Senator Robert M. La Follette? I think all men recognize that in time of war, the citizen must surrender some rights for the common good, which he's entitled to enjoy in times of peace. But, sir, the right to control their own government according to constitutional forms is not one of the rights that the citizens of this country are called upon to surrender in time of war. Rather, in time of war, the citizen must be more alert to the preservation of his right to control his government. He must be most watchful of the encroachment, which just means intrusion, of the military upon the civil power. He must beware of those precedents in support of arbitrary action by administration officials which, excused on the pleas of necessity in wartime, become the fixed rule when the necessity is passed and normal conditions have been restored. So it's going to become a normal thing after the fact, even after we go back to normal. More than all, the citizen and his representative in Congress in time of war must maintain his right of free speech. So, what the senator is saying here, one argument against restricting free speech. I think what's really stood out to me is that, well, it's understandable that some things need to be different in wartime, that it also is something you don't want to become a fixed rule later on when the necessity has passed and normal conditions have been restored. So you can summarize that for your one argument against restricting free speech in wartime. And again, I trust that you can put that into a complete sentence. Document 5. This source is excerpts of Supreme Court decision in Schenck v. U.S. Yep, I knew that was going to come up. Written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1919. So what's going to be asked of us about Holmes's opinion? Based on this document, why did the Supreme Court decide that no court could regard Charles Schenck's language as protected by constitutional right? Okay, so why? Let's make sure we know what he's saying here. No court could regard. Charles Shank's language as protected by any constitutional right. So why is he unprotected? Oliver Wendell Holmes is asking why the court decided that Shank was indeed not protected by the First Amendment for what he did. This is an indictment that charges a conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act of June 15, 1917. By causing and attempting to cause insubordination in the military and naval forces of the United States, and to obstruct the recruiting and enlistment services of the United States when the United States was at war with the German Empire. The charges state that the defendant willfully conspired to have printed and circulated to men who had been called and accepted for military service a document that set forth and alleged to be calculated to cause such insubordination and obstruction. The defendants were found guilty in all the counts. They, the Constitution's framers, set up the First Amendment to the Constitution forbidding Congress to make any law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. We admit that in many places in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. But in a Supreme Court document, this is big. But the character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it was done. The most stringent, just means strict, protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such an obstacle to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as our men are fighting at war, and therefore no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. So that use of the word but is, yeah, we get it, constitutional rights. But here's what he was accused of. They summarize that above. And they're saying by him making this leaflet during wartime, rather than just randomly during peacetime, he is actually endangering the national security of the United States. And they even use a clause from the Constitution, the clear and present danger clause. You can probably remember us talking a lot about that when we covered World War I and Shank versus U.S. So here is what he is accused of. Here is the, yes, we get it, there are rights, but clear and present danger, and you can summarize this in a sentence down here. When someone's speech presents a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States, it does not apply in those circumstances. And that's exactly what Oliver Wendell Holmes was saying about Charles Shank's leaflets that he helped produce. So, what do we have here? This source is a political cartoon, and it is from the Newark News, which has been reprinted, and it's from March 6, 1920. So, the Sedition Act continued to be enforced after World War I. It's labeled, "Swat the fly but use common sense." And you can see that this fly on the forehead of Uncle Sam, that's who's being depicted here, is labeled Reds. So the Red Scare is a concern shortly after World War I. But to continue enforcing the Espionage and Sedition Acts after World War I is too drastic. I went and violated my own rules again because I never even did read the question that's being asked of us here. But luckily this is just a cartoon with very few words to analyze. But what is the cartoonist's point of view of the U.S. government's use of sedition legislation? Well, it's pretty plain spoken here that they think that it's too drastic. So summarize that in a sentence. I have faith that you can do that. And now we've analyzed every single document. So now we can reference back to this generic outline format to create our own outline for this specific essay. So here is a blank format, and we'll go off of this. If you go back to the assignment page and you look, the historical context It's right here. So reading back through this again, throughout U.S. history, many constitutional and civic issues have been debated by Americans. These debates have resulted in efforts by individuals, groups, and governments to address these issues. These efforts have achieved varying degrees of success. One of these constitutional and civic issues is freedom of speech during wartime. Wow, what do you know? They pretty much gave you your entire introduction, because what I just bracketed and read is all historical context, and then this is a beautiful thesis, and it's all gift wrapped for you right here. So, I'm not going to bother writing out, I'm just going to make reference, color coded here, to label the historical context, and also to transfer over your listing thesis. In this case, there's only one thing. In this case, you're not exactly having your listing thesis naming two completely different things, like when I mentioned Babe Ruth and Thurman Munson in my generic outline before. But if you go back to that generic outline, you're also discussing a civic issue and then the efforts and whether they were a success or not. So it is perfectly fine to use that gift-wrapped thesis statement. So we have our civic issue. We know they've already given it to us. It is free speech in wartime. We also know, having analyzed the documents, that there were efforts to address this civic issue. Specifically the Schenck versus U.S. decision. We will figure out where that comes into play, what specific document when we reference back to that, and were those efforts a success or not. So before you can go through and pull information, it's probably best to really quickly go through your documents again and say, hey, am I going to include this in body paragraph number 1, or am I going to include this in body paragraph number 2? Document 1, the First Amendment to the Constitution. Well, this is something I can include in the first body paragraph. So I'll make a list here, Doc 1, because it's referencing the First Amendment declaring that people have free speech. Then we have the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which, again, I will list because that is summarizing what was going on during wartime. Then we have document 3, which is the pamphlet. That is going to be one of our efforts, is Schenck saying, hey, don't serve, refuse to be drafted. If you haven't volunteered, you can't be forced. That pamphlet is his free speech. He is trying to challenge these laws that limit free speech during wartime by passing that pamphlet. Then document 4. You also have this free speech in wartime speech being given by Robert M. La Follette, a senator, and he gave that in 1917, which is actually even prior to Schenck. So let's go. Now, Doc 5. Oh, the Supreme Court decision. And then the opinion of the time that these laws that were limiting speech in wartime were actually way too harsh, which can also be included in the second body paragraph. So now we can specifically, this is the First Amendment. These two are the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So this will be a good description of the fact that all the way back to the founding of the nation we have free speech, but then during World War I there was a limiting of free speech using the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and then a nice transition sentence might be that some people disagreed with this, and then that'll transition you nicely to the efforts and successes. Now, notice how quickly I'm doing this. You don't want to spend a lot of time outlining your thoughts, because an outline can't be graded. An outline can't count towards your test score. So you want to move right into writing the essay as soon as possible. So making it real quick like this is important. So now you've got docs 3, 4, 5, and 6 that are going to help you address efforts and whether they were successful or not. And if you remember the speech by La Follette, document 4, this takes place in 1917. That is one of the first things, chronologically speaking, that takes place. So that's your nice transition that I mentioned, where you're mentioning at the end of the first paragraph about, first body paragraph that is, about how some people disagreed with this. Well, then the very first sentence of your next paragraph could be, specifically, Senator Robert La Follette was speaking that people should maintain their free speech even in wartime in the midst of World War I. Once the war was over, there's no need for the Espionage and Sedition Acts anymore, right? So that's where the Socialist Party pamphlet written by Charles Schenck is saying, hey, you don't need to be drafted and sent to the military anymore. The war is over. It's been won. This is definitely a violation of civil liberties now that the war is over. And so referencing Schenck and his pamphlet would be the second thing to do. So let's label these things. Mentioning this first chronologically, then this, then probably the Supreme Court decision that came out addressing how Schenck was going to remain in prison and that it was due to the clear and present danger clause, but that public opinion was largely with Schenck because a 1920 political cartoon says that it was too harsh that they were still enforcing the Espionage and Sedition Acts even after the war was over. Again, make this quick organization of your thoughts very brief so that you can get right to writing the essay. And you're going to repeat probably a lot of what you did in the introductory paragraph, but you're going to mix up the wording of the thesis. So restate thesis, and I'm going to put in parentheses the switching the order of the sentence symbol. And then what are some of the most important points? I'm going to use something color-coded in order to do this so you're not wasting time writing it down. You could do this with a highlighter or something the day of the test. And what are the most important things to include? Well, how about the right having been enshrined in the Constitution ever since the Bill of Rights was added in 1791? Then you can point out that there was a major court battle over this, and that public opinion rested with Schenck. So again, re-mentioning, First Amendment has always existed. There was a major court battle, and public opinion was largely with Schenck because there was obviously political cartoons being published on his behalf. So going through this really quickly again. Your historical context and listing thesis in the introduction are more or less going to be word for word what was gift wrapped to you on the assignment page. Then you're going to go to your what is the civic issue and was it successful, the efforts that were undertaken to deal with that issue in your two body paragraphs. In the first body paragraph, you're going to have documents 1 and 2A and 2B helping you out, which reference the First Amendment and the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which were passed during World War I. Then in your next paragraph, you're going to have 3, 4, 5, and 6 helping you tell the story, and notice again, they're numbered, that the senator's speech will be the first thing you mention, chronologically speaking, then talking about Charles Schenck and his pamphlet, the fact that there was a big court battle over this issue, and lastly, and I forgot to label this before, that the last thing you're going to talk about is, hey, public opinion was with him. Then, in your conclusion, you're going to restate your thesis in slightly different words, probably switch the order of the sentence in order to make it sound slightly different, and then You're going to summarize your major points, 1, 2, and 3. That gives you a nice 4-sentence conclusion, and you're off, and you're writing. This civic literacy essay, I can't stress this enough, is going to be on 2 different sides of the scale in some way, shape, or form. So you definitely want to do this right after the multiple choice section and before you do the 2 short essays. So reach out to me in class if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful.